July 15, 2026. In the span of 6 hours last night, the United States military eliminated 4 of the last senior commanders capable of directing Iran's remaining military response. Not soldiers. Not checkpoint guards, not fast boat crews, the architects. The men who sat in the rooms where targeting decisions were made, where missile launch windows were approved, where the orders that sent drones into apartment buildings in Bahrain and Kuwait originated. 4 names, 4 confirmed strikes, 4 command nodes that no longer exist as of this morning. And the part of this story that is being completely missed in the surface-level coverage is not the strikes themselves. It is what happens to a military machine when you do not just destroy its equipment, you destroy the people who know how to use what is left of it. Because a fast boat without a commander is a boat. A missile battery without an officer who understands the fire control sequence is scrap metal with a warhead attached. And an intelligence apparatus without the specific individuals who built its human networks over 20 years does not simply reorganize itself overnight. It collapses. That is what happened last night. Let us back all the way up, because to understand why the United States shifted from destroying Iranian hardware to eliminating Iranian minds, you need to understand exactly what changed in the 72 hours before these strikes happened, and why the target list itself tells you something the Pentagon has not said out loud. For the first several weeks of this campaign, the American strategy was built around infrastructure: radar dishes, missile storage, naval facilities, command buildings. The doctrine was simple: remove the physical tools of Iranian military power one target at a time until the regime had nothing left to fight with. That doctrine produced the 300 target campaigns, the burning coastlines, the silent radar networks. But infrastructure can, in theory, be rebuilt. Buildings can be reconstructed. Even destroyed missile stockpiles can eventually be replenished through whatever supply lines Iran still has access to. What cannot be rebuilt in any meaningful operational timeframe is institutional knowledge held inside the heads of specific human beings who spent decades inside these organizations. And sometime in the last week, American and Allied intelligence made a determination that shifted the entire targeting philosophy of this war. If the physical infrastructure is already collapsing, the fastest way to accelerate the collapse of the institution itself is to remove the people holding it together. That is the Mastermind campaign. And last night is when it went fully operational. Here is the confirmed picture as of this morning. Brigadier General Hassan Moradi, identified by multiple intelligence sources as the operational coordinator overseeing IRGC drone strike authorization against Gulf state targets, was killed in a precision strike on a facility outside Bandar Abbas. Moradi is not a name that appeared in public reporting before this week, and that absence is itself significant. He was not a public-facing commander who gave interviews or appeared at state ceremonies. He was the kind of figure who exists deliberately in the background, the person whose signature approves a targeting package before it ever reaches the launch crew. Removing him does not just remove one officer. It removes the specific individual who understood exactly how the drone strike approval chain functioned, who else needed to sign off, and how fast that chain could move under pressure. Whoever replaces him inherits the title without inheriting any of that operational knowledge. The second strike hit a command vehicle moving between Avaz and the interior, killing Colonel Farid Rostami, identified as the coordinator responsible for what remains of the IRGC's mobile ballistic missile launch teams. Read that carefully, not the missiles themselves. The man who knew which launch crews were still operational, where they were currently dispersed, and how to coordinate a launch sequence across multiple hidden positions without exposing them all simultaneously to American surveillance. That is an extraordinarily specific skill set built over years of operational experience, and it does not transfer to a replacement officer through a memo. The third and most significant strike of the night hit a compound in Kerman province, killing a man that 2 separate intelligence sources have identified as a senior liaison officer, connecting the IRGC's remaining command structure to what is left of its regional proxy network. The individual responsible for relaying instructions to affiliated militias in Iraq and Yemen when Tehran's own communications infrastructure is degraded. This is the connective tissue role. Remove it, and the various fragments of Iran's regional network do not just lose a messenger. They lose the one channel that allowed a fragmented command structure to still function as something resembling a coordinated actor across borders. The fourth strike, and the one drawing the most attention inside intelligence circles this morning, killed a figure identified only through partial confirmation as a senior IRGC intelligence officer, with direct responsibility for the human surveillance networks used to track high-value targets, including, according to two individuals briefed on the strike, some of the same tracking methodology that Iran itself had used earlier in this conflict against American and allied assets. The man who built Iran's targeting capability against its enemies was, last night, on the receiving end of exactly that kind of targeting himself. That detail alone tells you how far inside Iran's own operational architecture American and allied intelligence has now penetrated. 4 names, 4 different functions: drone authorization, missile mobility, regional liaison, human intelligence. This was not a scattered set of opportunistic strikes. This was a single coordinated operation designed to remove 4 separate load-bearing pillars of the IRGC's remaining operational capability in the same night. Each one selected because of the specific institutional function they performed rather than their public rank or visibility. And that is the detail the surface-level coverage keeps missing. This was not about rank, this was about function. Now let's talk about how strikes like this actually become possible. Because the targeting precision on display here did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quickly. To kill a specific kernel in a moving vehicle, to know which liaison officer sits at the center of a proxy communication network, to identify a human intelligence chief who does not appear on any public roster, requires months, sometimes years of accumulated signals intelligence, human intelligence, and pattern of life analysis. It requires knowing not just where someone lives, but where they move, who they meet, what vehicles they use, what communications discipline they maintain, and where the gaps in that discipline exist. The fact that American and allied forces were able to execute 4 of these strikes in a single coordinated window tells you that this targeting picture has been under development for a long time, and that the current phase of degradation inside Iran's command structure, the fragmentation, the invisible supreme leader, the disconnected communications between the negotiating apparatus and the operational commanders, has created exactly the kind of security vacuum that makes this scale of penetration possible. When an organization is confident and disciplined, it maintains operational security even under pressure. When an organization is fragmenting, individual commanders start making individual mistakes, communicating through channels they should not be using, moving with less caution because the broader institutional structure that used to enforce discipline is no longer functioning the way it once did. The masterminds did not just get unlucky last night. They got sloppy because the institution around them was already coming apart. Let's go deeper into why this specific target category, human command capability rather than physical infrastructure, represents such a different kind of pressure than anything applied earlier in this conflict. A destroyed radar site is a known, bounded loss. Engineers can eventually assess the damage, procure replacement parts, and rebuild, assuming the money and the supply chain exist, which increasingly they do not. But a command structure that loses its drone authorization officer, its mobile missile coordinator, its regional liaison, and its human intelligence chief in a single night does not experience a bounded, quantifiable loss. It experiences a systemic shock that ripples outward in ways that are almost impossible to fully calculate from the outside. Every operation that Moradi was in the middle of planning is now suspended, delayed, or abandoned, because whoever inherits his role has to reconstruct his operational picture from scratch. Often without access to his personal notes, his private communications, or the informal relationships he had built with the launch crews who trusted him. Every mobile missile team that Rostami was coordinating is now, at least temporarily, operating with degraded command guidance, which means launches become more hesitant, more poorly timed, or simply do not happen at all because nobody in the chain has the authority or the confidence to give the order. This is what military planners mean when they talk about attacking a system rather than attacking targets. You are not counting bodies. You are measuring the collapse of coordination itself. Now let's talk about the reaction inside Tehran. Because the pattern here is worth examining closely against everything we have already established about the fractured state of Iranian command and control. Iranian state media confirmed the deaths of 2 of the 4 officers within hours, which is itself unusual, because the regime's default instinct throughout this entire conflict has been delay. Denial and the gas leak explanation deployed until the cover story becomes unsustainable. The fact that state media moved quickly to confirm two of these deaths suggests one of two things. Either the deaths were so immediately and publicly obvious that denial was not a viable option, or someone inside the regime made a deliberate decision that acknowledging the losses quickly served some internal political purpose, perhaps rallying domestic outrage, perhaps signaling to the remaining commanders that the leadership is aware of what is happening to them. The other two deaths, including the human intelligence officer, have not been officially acknowledged at all. Silence in the pattern this conflict has established repeatedly usually means the details are worse than the regime wants to admit, or that acknowledging the loss would reveal operational information the IRGC does not want confirmed. The IRGC's public statement following the strikes used language that by now should be immediately recognizable to anyone who has followed this conflict closely. A promise of a crushing and unprecedented response, a vow that the blood of the martyrs will not go unanswered. The same maximalist rhetorical framework that has followed every single significant loss the regime has absorbed since this war began. Rhetoric that costs nothing to produce and requires no operational capability to back it up. But here is the detail worth sitting with. This is now the fourth or fifth time in this conflict that Iranian officials have promised a crushing and unprecedented response to a major loss. Read that again. If every single one of those promised responses had actually been crushing and unprecedented, this conflict would look completely different than it currently does. The gap between the promised response and the delivered response has become, at this point, the single most reliable predictor in this entire war. The louder the rhetoric, the weaker the actual capability behind it tends to be. Now let's examine what this means for the negotiating track, because the elimination of these four specific figures intersects directly with the most important open question in this entire conflict. Who inside Iran actually has the authority to make a deal stick? We have already established that the supreme leader has been functionally invisible for months, that the negotiating apparatus led by figures like Kalibaf has repeatedly made public statements disconnected from operational military reality, and that the IRGC's operational commanders appear to be making decisions independent of whatever diplomatic signals are coming out of Doha or Islamabad. Last night's strikes make that fragmentation dramatically worse, not better. Every one of the four men killed last night held a piece of institutional knowledge that connected some part of the military apparatus to the broader command structure. Removing all four simultaneously does not just weaken Iran's military capability. It further scrambles the question of who, precisely, is even capable of enforcing compliance with any agreement that gets signed. If the mobile missile teams no longer have clear coordination with Central Command, does an agreement to halt missile operations actually reach the people who would need to comply with it? If the regional liaison officer connecting Tehran to its proxy networks is gone, does a ceasefire commitment made in Doha actually propagate down to militia commanders in Iraq who may not even be aware the negotiation happened? This is the structural risk that keeps showing up throughout this entire conflict, and last night's strikes have made it measurably worse. A fragmented command structure does not become easier to negotiate with when you remove more of its connective tissue. It becomes harder because there are now fewer people left who are capable of making a decision that the rest of the apparatus will actually follow. Let's talk about the broader strategic doctrine at play here. Because what is happening right now represents the maturation of a targeting philosophy that intelligence and military planners have been developing for years. One that the American campaign in Iran is now applying at a scale and precision that few previous conflicts have demonstrated. The doctrine holds that modern military organizations, especially ones built around ideological loyalty and informal personal networks rather than pure institutional process, are far more vulnerable to the loss of specific individuals than conventional militaries with deep bureaucratic redundancy. A conventional army trains its officers through standardized processes designed specifically so that any qualified replacement can step into a role with minimal disruption. An organization like the IRGC, built through decades of ideological recruitment, personal loyalty networks, and informal relationships between commanders who often knew each other for years before they held their current positions, does not have that same redundancy. When you remove Moradi, you are not removing a job title. You are removing 20 years of personal relationships with launch crews who trusted him specifically, informal knowledge of which subordinates could be relied upon under pressure, and an intuitive understanding of how to move information through the organization quickly that a new officer, however qualified on paper, simply does not possess on day one. That vulnerability is precisely what this new phase of the campaign is exploiting. And the speed and precision of last night's 4 simultaneous strikes suggests that American and Allied intelligence has mapped this vulnerability with extraordinary specificity. There is also a psychological dimension to this that deserves direct examination, because eliminating masterminds produces an effect that eliminating equipment simply cannot replicate. Every remaining officer inside the IRGC's command structure now has to process a very specific and very personal question. If 4 of my colleagues, men who operated with the same operational security discipline that I maintain, men who were careful, experienced, senior enough to believe themselves insulated from this kind of targeting, could be identified and killed within a single coordinated window, what does that mean about my own exposure? This is not a theoretical fear. This is the lived reality that every remaining commander inside Iran's fractured military structure is now operating under, and that psychological pressure does not just create individual anxiety. It creates institutional paralysis. Commanders become more hesitant to communicate through any channel that might be compromised. They become more reluctant to move according to predictable patterns. They become, in effect, less operationally effective, not because their equipment has been destroyed, but because the confidence required to execute military operations decisively has been systematically undermined at the individual human level. Now let's put this into the context of everything else converging on Tehran simultaneously, because the mastermind strikes are not happening in isolation. They are happening against the backdrop of a coastal military infrastructure that has already been reduced to rubble across multiple consecutive nights of strikes. They are happening against the backdrop of an oil revenue lifeline that has been repeatedly frozen and reopened and frozen again. They are happening against the backdrop of Arab states that have now entered this conflict as independent military actors, striking Iranian territory directly rather than through the deniable buffer of American or Israeli operations. They are happening against the backdrop of a supreme leader who could not safely attend his own father's funeral, an absence that told the entire region something about the actual state of security inside the regime's own core leadership. Every one of these pressure tracks, military, financial, psychological, has been compounding for weeks. And last night's mastermind strikes represent the point where the military track has evolved from destroying what Iran has into destroying who Iran has left to use what remains of it. The honest assessment of where this leaves the conflict is this: Iran's remaining military capability, whatever equipment survives the ongoing infrastructure campaign, is now operating without several of the specific individuals who understood how to use that equipment effectively under wartime conditions. The command structure that was already fragmented before last night is now measurably more fragmented. The negotiating track, already complicated by the question of who inside Iran actually has the authority to make and enforce a binding agreement, has become more complicated still. Because some of the individuals who would have been responsible for implementing compliance across the military apparatus no longer exist. And the psychological pressure on the commanders who remain, the ones who now understand that seniority, caution, and operational discipline did not protect their colleagues, is compounding in ways that will shape decision-making inside that command structure for weeks to come, regardless of what happens on any single night of strikes going forward. What happens next depends on a question that has defined this entire conflict from its earliest days and still does not have a clear answer this morning: whether the remaining pieces of Iran's fractured command structure can reconstitute enough coordination to continue functioning as something resembling a coherent military actor, or whether the loss of these 4 specific individuals in a single coordinated night represents the moment the institutional coherence finally gave way entirely. The equipment is burning along the coastline, the revenue is frozen, the supreme leader is invisible, and now the people who knew how to hold the remaining pieces together are gone. Whoever inherits their responsibilities this morning is inheriting a set of titles without the years of relationships, trust, and institutional knowledge that made those titles function as actual command authority. That is the operational reality of July 15th, 2026. And it is the reality that every remaining commander inside Iran's military structure is now waking up to.